6 players who instantly make teams better. We looked at this a while back with all-time players, but I was looking around the league recently and realized that this video needs to be talked about with current players. And for this list, we're not talking about just any stars, we're talking about players that get drafted or traded to these bad teams, then instantly, the very next season, make them into great and even playoff teams. And if any players you were expecting didn't make this list, go back and check, and it's probably because they didn't instantly make their team better. But let's start with Jimmy Butler, who was one of the main inspirations behind this video. And he's one of the rare superstars in this league that doesn't really ever put up huge numbers, but just him being out there on the floor makes all of his teams better. And it's rare because you really can't pinpoint what it is about him aside from just his leadership and demanding greatness from his team. But the first instance where this became clear was in 2017, when he left the Chicago Bulls. So in 2016 and 17, the Bulls had a 41-41 record and lost in the first round of the playoffs. Then Jimmy gets traded away in the offseason for Levine, Markkanen, and Dunn, and that next season the Bulls finish 27-55 without Jimmy. Now I will say that some other players did leave the team too at the same time, but the next season Butler proved that he was the biggest reason for that difference in wins and losses, because he was now on a bad Timberwolves team that never had anywhere near a winning season with Towns and Wiggins and finished with a 31-51 record in 2017. Well, after Jimmy got there, they went to 47-35 and made it to the playoffs. Then Jimmy leaves the team the next season and they go right back down to 36-46. And by the way, he really does lead everyone to wins, because he even led those third stringers to being the Wolves starters, even though he only scored 2 points that game, and that perfectly describes the kind of player he is. But okay, then 2 years later, he ends up on the Miami Heat, which was last year. In the 2018-19 season, the Heat missed the playoffs and had a 39-43 record. They were a young team with potential, but hadn't shown it yet. Then Jimmy Butler joins the team, and they finished with a slightly improved 44-38 record, but took the Lakers to 6 games in the NBA Finals. And coming into that season, they had lost Josh Richardson, Hassan Whiteside, and Dwayne Wade, so they weren't expected to be great. To be fair though, in 2020 they did replace those guys with Tyler Hero, Andre Iguodala, and Kendrick Nunn, while Bam Adebayo and Duncan Robinson developed a ton. But to be even more fair, I think it's safe to say that none of those guys would have been as great as they were without Jimmy leading the way. And I think that's more than clear if you actually watched the NBA Finals last year, because when nobody else could get anything going, he was the one that stepped up and had that all-time great game, and had a couple of those too. So with all that, it's safe to say that Jimmy Butler makes his teams better. LeBron James. Okay, now this one's obvious, and I didn't want this entire list to just be filled with superstars, because you'd think it'd be obvious that they would be the ones to instantly make their teams better, but that's not really the case. There's only a couple more superstars on this list. As for LeBron though, the stats speak for themselves. Way back in 2002, the Cavs finished with a terrible 17-65 record. They draft James first overall, and that instantly improves the record to 35-47 the next season. Then he eventually leads the Cavs to the finals, makes them a consistent 60-win team with no other real help, finished with a 61-21 record his last season there. He then leaves for the Miami Heat, and they instantly drop down to a 19-63 record. That's a 42-win difference just by LeBron leaving, and that's one of the biggest season-to-season differentials in NBA history. Then once on the Heat, it's a little harder to say just how much of a difference he made, because they made that super team and had a lot of great role players, but they do become an all-time great team, make the finals every year together, and win 2 championships. But then in 2014, LeBron leaves the team, and in these guys last year together, they had a 54-28 record and again made the NBA Finals. But so James leaves, and with Wade and Bosh still both on the roster, they now finish with a 37-45 record and miss the playoffs completely. Sure, some of the other role players left the team too when LeBron did, but we know that he was the one that had the biggest impact. And while he was away, the Cavs, well, they had never recovered and had a 33-49 record before he returned, and then a 53-29 record with him, and again made it right back to the NBA Finals. And this continued for the next 3 seasons. Even after Kyrie left and LeBron's last season there, they still made it to the finals and finished with 50 wins. So James leaves to the Lakers, the Cavs go way back down to 19-63, then of course this year he helped LA to another championship. Kawhi Leonard. So Kawhi's been on 3 different teams. He was drafted by the Spurs and didn't make them any better right away as a rookie, but in the 2018 offseason, San Antonio traded him for DeMar DeRozan to the Raptors. And keep in mind, before Kawhi, Toronto was a good team every year. DeMar and Lowry were able to make the playoffs nearly every single year, were always a 50-win team, and even finished with the best record in the East at one point. But that was it. No matter how good they looked or how much their games developed, they just couldn't win a championship, let alone make an NBA Finals. But then Kawhi replaces DeMar, and in that same season takes his Raptors team and wins them their first championship, and becomes the best Raptors player of all time. Now, there are a couple contingencies that I know people might point out, like it was LeBron's first year not in the East, so he wasn't there to stop the Raptors like he had in the past. They also added Marc Gasol to the team, which was huge. Pascal Siakam developed into the league's most improved player that year, and in the finals the Warriors lost out on both Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant. Well, all that's true, and if you want to look at it that way and not give Kawhi his credit, that's fine. But I mean, he did all he could do. He couldn't control any of those other factors. All he could do was win a championship, and he did while putting up some all-time great performances. Also, by joining the Clippers, himself and Paul George instantly made this team real title threats, and it's not his fault way off P blew it. Chris Paul. And I put CP in the same category with Jimmy Butler. Guys that aren't like top 5 players that always put up these incredible stats, but still are leaders and make every single team they play on better. I mean, there isn't a single team in his career that Chris has been on that he hasn't made dramatically better. And it starts when he was first drafted. So in 2005, the Hornets finished with an 18-64 record. Then Chris was drafted, and with the help of David West, he averaged 17-7 as a rookie, and that season the record went up to 38-44, a 20-win difference, and they continued to improve. And when he finally started to hit his stride, becoming a first-time All-Star, averaging 21, 11, and almost 3 steals a game, he led them to a 56-26 record, taking the Spurs to 7 games in the 2008 playoffs. He then misses 40 games due to injury in 2010, and with no other changes to that team, they fall back down to a 37-45 record that year. Then after that, in 2011, he's fully healthy, and that next season they're back to normal. They go right back up to a 46-36 record. But then Chris leaves to the Clippers that offseason, and without him, they fall to 21-45 during the lockout season. So that shows right there just the impact he had on the Hornets. And before he got to the Clippers, they had been terrible for most of the time they've existed, and were 32-50 this season before he got there. Well, after he got there, they improved to 40-26 in the lockout season, making it to the second round of the playoffs. Then improved to 56-26 the next season. And you get the point, he made the Clippers better too. So he eventually moves on to Houston, giving James Harden the best season of his career, helping him to a 65-17 record, taking the Warriors to 7 games in the Western Conference Finals. And now today, it's still very early in the season, but the Suns are sitting with one of the best records in the Western Conference. And if his past is any indicator of his future, things probably aren't going to change too much throughout the year. Donovan Mitchell. So Donovan Mitchell's a rare circumstance because he's only played for one team, but he did instantly make them better. And it's rare because not too many rookies really do that for their first team. I mean, guys like Joel Embiid, Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, Trae Young, Jason Tatum, Devin Booker, none of these young players were able to make their team that much better in their first season. It took them at least 2 to do it, but not for Mitchell. So in 2017, Gordon Hayward left the Jazz in free agency, and Joe Johnson got traded. Utah was expected to be a bad team in 2018, missed the playoffs, and stay that way for at least a couple of years. But then they drafted Donovan, and with very few other roster changes, he surprises everyone, averaging 20 points a game, leads the Jazz to only 3 less wins the next year after losing their All-Star, beats Paul George, Russell Westbrook, and Carmelo Anthony in the playoffs 4-2, then he gets swept by the Warriors. But okay, the Warriors won the title that year. Either way though, he's another great leader, and it turns out that that's one of the biggest factors a player needs if they want to instantly make their team better. And last up, we got Rajon Rondo. And Rondo's a little different because he makes every team he's on much better in the playoffs. Playoff Rondo is a real thing, and we all forgot about it for a little while because he made his name on the Celtics playing with Boston's Big Three, and played so well it was often referred to as the Big Four. And in the regular season, he was great and even an all-star at times, but he was way more like a superstar in the playoffs. He would go from averaging 11-8 in the regular season to 17-11 in the playoffs that same year. There's just something about him as a player, his leadership, and the way his game translates when the pace is slowed down, that makes him so much better. And he's always been this way. He was like that every year he made the playoffs in Boston, and still is today. And I said we forgot about him for a while because after Boston, he did spend a few years bouncing around bad teams that didn't really make the playoffs, and if they didn't play him much, in Dallas, Sacramento, and Chicago. But in New Orleans, playoff Rondo came back in a big way, and he did the same for the Lakers this past year, and while playing with another superstar, just really changed these teams. And that's all 6. So if you enjoyed this video, drop a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.